Give your sister the nursery, or find somewhere else to live. That's what my daughter said to me, standing in the doorway of the room I had slept in for 11 years, the room that still had my late wife's reading chair in the corner, and her handwriting on the closet shelf liner. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I went upstairs, packed one suitcase, and by the time anyone realized I was serious, I had already signed a single piece of paper that changed everything. My daughter's face went white when she finally understood what that paper meant. Before I go any further, thank you for being here with me today. It means more than you probably know. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching from, your city, your country, your time zone. I like knowing who's sitting with me while I tell this. A small note before we start. This story weaves in some fictional elements for the sake of the telling. The names in the town are not real, but everything underneath them is true enough to matter. My name is Walter Combs. I am 71 years old. I spent 43 years installing and servicing HVAC systems across 3 counties, first as an employee, then as the owner of Combs Heating and Air, a company I built out of a single-use van and a toolbox my father left me. I raised 2 daughters. I loved one woman for 39 years, and when she passed, I thought the hardest part of my life was already behind me. I want to tell you about the night my younger daughter told me to give up my room for a baby that hadn't been born yet, and about the third option I found instead of the 2 she gave me. I need you to understand something before the story really starts. This is not a tale about a bitter old man nursing a grudge. I am not bitter. I have learned, slowly and at some cost, that bitterness is what happens when a person swallows an insult and lets it sit and rot in his chest instead of naming it out loud. What I felt on the night my daughter Paige stood in my doorway with her arms crossed was not bitterness. It was something far quieter and far more useful. It was clarity. Let me take you back to where this all began, because you cannot understand a man's third option without understanding the 2 rooms he built his life inside of. I married my wife, Doris, in the spring of 1978. I was 23. She was 21, working as a receptionist at a dentist's office 2 towns over, and she had a laugh that made strangers in restaurants turn around to see what was so funny. We had nothing when we married: a rented duplex on the wrong side of the tracks in Danbury, a mattress on the floor for the first 4 months, and a hand-me-down kitchen table with one leg shorter than the other 3. I used to joke that the table kept us humble. Doris used to say the table kept me from getting too big for my britches, which was her way of saying the same thing with more affection in it. I was working for a man named Ellis Whitfield at the time, doing HVAC installs and repairs 6 days a week, and some Sundays when the calls came in during a heat wave and Ellis needed the extra hands. I learned everything I know about ductwork and refrigerant lines and compressor motors from that man, and I learned something else from him too, without either of us naming it at the time. I learned that a man who is good with his hands and honest with his customers will never go hungry in this country, even if he never gets rich either. Our first daughter, Renee, was born in 1981. I remember standing in the hallway of Danbury General with a paper cup of vending machine coffee going cold in my hand, and when the nurse came out and told me I had a daughter, my knees actually buckled a little, right there in the hallway, in front of God and everybody. I had not expected that. I thought I was prepared. I was not prepared. Nothing prepares you for the specific weight of hearing that you are now responsible, permanently and completely, for another human life. Renee was a quiet baby, and she grew into a quiet, watchful child, the kind who sat in the corner of a room and noticed everything before she said a word about any of it. Doris used to say Renee had an old soul. I used to say Renee had my mother's eyes and my own stubborn streak, and between the 2 of us we were probably both right. 3 years later, in 1984, our second daughter, Paige, arrived, and if Renee was quiet water, Paige was a firecracker from the moment she took her first breath. She cried louder, she laughed louder, she wanted things louder, and there is something about a second child, something I did not understand until I had lived through it myself, where the parents are simply more tired and more permissive than they were the first time around. We told ourselves we were being consistent. We were not being consistent. We gave Paige things we had made Renee earn, and we told ourselves it evened out somehow over the years. It did not even out. I know that now. I did not know it then, and that failure of mine sits at the root of everything that happened decades later, though it took me a long time and a great deal of pain to trace the line all the way back. I started Combs Heating and Air in 1986, with $1,200 in savings, a used Chevy panel van with 140,000 miles on it, and a heater that only blew warm air if you hit the dash just right, which became something of a family joke for the next decade. Doris kept the books at the kitchen table in the evenings after the girls went to bed, a ledger and a calculator and a cup of decaf that she never finished, and some of my best memories of those years are simply the sound of her pencil scratching numbers into columns while I sat across from her reading the newspaper, either of us saying much, both of us entirely at peace. The company grew slowly and honestly. By 1995 I had 4 employees. By 2005 I had 11, and we had moved from residential-only work into small commercial contracts, offices, a couple of restaurants, one elementary school system that stayed with us for 18 years because I never once padded an invoice and everybody in that district office knew it. I am telling you all of this not to brag on myself, but because you need to understand exactly what kind of foundation was underneath my feet on the night my daughter told me to leave. I did not arrive at that kitchen doorway as a helpless old man with nothing. I arrived there as a man who had built something real, slowly, over 40 years, with his own 2 hands and his wife's steady arithmetic beside him. There is one story from those early business years I want to tell you, because I think it explains something important about the kind of man I was before any of this happened, and about the values I tried, imperfectly, to pass down to both my daughters, even if only one of them fully absorbed them. In the winter of 1991, a widow named Mrs. Alberta Finch called me out to her small house on the edge of town, her furnace having gone out entirely during the coldest week of the year. I arrived to find the ignition control board had failed, a part that would cost, at the time, nearly $400 to replace, a significant sum for a business still finding its footing, and an even larger sum, I quickly gathered, for a widow living on a fixed income in a house with peeling paint and a leaking roof she clearly could not afford to fix either. I replaced the part that afternoon and told her, when she asked for the invoice, that the part itself had been covered under a manufacturer's warranty I happened to know had actually expired 8 months earlier. I only charged her for my labor, $60, and I drove home that evening and told Doris what I'd done, expecting perhaps a gentle scolding about the business not being able to absorb losses like that too often. Doris had looked at me across the kitchen table, the ledger open in front of her, and said simply, "Walter, if we can help an old widow stay warm in the winter of all things, then I don't much see the point of building this business at all. Just don't make a habit of it where we can't pay our own bills, and we'll be just fine." I did not make a habit of giving away free labor, but I never once, in nearly 4 decades of running that business, turned away an elderly customer in genuine need without finding some way to make the job affordable for them, even if it meant a thinner margin for the company that particular month. I tell you this story because I want you to understand that the values underneath my decision about Paige's Trust were not new values I discovered late in life out of hurt feelings. They were the same values Doris and I had lived by for our entire marriage, that dignity and fairness matter more than convenience, that the people around you deserve to be treated with basic respect regardless of what they can do for you in return, and that a person who understands this instinctively toward strangers should, by all rights, understand it even more clearly toward their own family. Somewhere along the way, in raising Paige, I had failed to make that second, closer application of the lesson land the way the first one always had. Doris and I built a genuinely good life together across those decades, not a flawless one, but a good and honest one. We took the girls camping most summers at a lake 3 hours north, modest trips, a rented cabin with no air conditioning and mosquitoes thick enough to chase you indoors by dusk, but I remember those weeks now with more warmth than I remember almost anything else from those years. We argued, occasionally, the way any married couple argues, mostly over small things, whether to replace the old truck or nurse it along another year, whether Paige's increasingly frequent requests for money as a teenager should be granted or gently refused, and Doris, I want to be honest, was usually the one arguing for the gentler, more generous position, while I was usually the one arguing for the firmer line. I gave in to her more often than I should have, on that particular question, and I have wondered many times since whether some of what happened decades later traces back to those early disagreements, decided in Doris's favor out of simple love for her rather than out of any careful long-term thinking about what it would teach our younger daughter. I do not say this to blame Doris for anything. She is not here to explain her own reasoning, and I would not put words in her mouth even if she were. I say it only because I think an honest telling of this story requires me to admit that the pattern which eventually led Paige to a kitchen doorway ultimatum did not begin the week of that ultimatum, or even the year before it. It began decades earlier, in small kitchen table disagreements about how firmly to hold a line with a demanding, high-spirited younger daughter, disagreements in which love, understandably but perhaps mistakenly, kept winning out over discipline. Doris was diagnosed with ovarian cancer in the fall of 2016. She fought it for 2 years and 4 months, and I was with her for nearly every appointment, every infusion, every long night in a recliner beside a hospital bed watching the numbers on a monitor tick along in their quiet, indifferent rhythm. She passed in February of 2019, on a Tuesday afternoon, with my hand in hers and the winter light coming flat and gray through the hospital window. I will not pretend that grief like that ever fully leaves a man. It does not. It changes shape. It becomes something you carry rather than something that knocks you flat, but it never disappears entirely, and I have stopped expecting it to. After Doris passed, the house on Larkspur Lane, the house we had bought in 1994 and paid off in full by 2011, felt enormous and silent in a way I had not braced myself for. Renee, by then 38 and married to a good, steady man named Curtis, lived 40 minutes away and called me every Sunday evening, regular as church bells, and came by with her 2 boys most weekends, letting them run through my backyard the way Doris and I once let Renee and Paige run through it. Paige, 35 at the time of her mother's passing, lived 12 minutes away with her husband, Trevor, in a rented townhouse, and her calls came less often, and when they came they were shorter. And I told myself, the way a father tells himself these things, that she was simply busier, that her grief expressed itself differently than her sister's, that I should not measure my daughters against each other. I still believe a father should not measure his daughters against each other. But I have also learned that there is a difference between not measuring and refusing to notice, and for a long time I confused the two. It was Paige and Trevor who suggested, gently at first, in the spring of 2020, that I might consider selling the house on Larkspur Lane. It's so much space for one person, Dad, Paige said, sitting across from me at my own kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon, and Trevor nodded along in the particular way he had of nodding along to whatever Paige said, as though he had arrived at the opinion independently and simultaneously, which he never once had in the 11 years I'd known him. You could get something smaller, easier to manage, Paige continued. Something without stairs. I told them I liked the stairs. I liked the house. I liked the garden Doris had planted along the east fence, the tomatoes and the marigolds she'd insisted kept the tomatoes healthy, though I never once saw the science of that proven. I told them I wasn't ready to think about selling, and Paige let it drop, that time, the way you let a fishing line go slack when the fish hasn't taken the hook yet. She brought it up again in the fall of 2021, and again in the spring of 2022, each time a little more directly, each time framing it a little more explicitly as a matter of practicality rather than sentiment. By the time I understood what I was actually looking at, it was already the fall of 2023, and Paige was 7 months pregnant with her first child, and the conversation had stopped being about whether I should sell the house at all, and had become, without my ever quite noticing the shift, a conversation about which room in my house would become the nursery. I want to pause here and tell you about the room itself, because the room matters more to this story than almost anything else in it. When we bought the house on Larkspur Lane in 1994, it had 4 bedrooms. The largest was Doris's and mine. The 2 middle bedrooms went to Renee and Paige, growing up. The 4th, the smallest, at the back of the house, overlooking the garden, had been Doris's sewing room for the first 15 years we lived there, and then, when her illness made climbing to the 2nd floor difficult in her final year, We had converted it into a downstairs bedroom for her, with a hospital bed and a reading chair and a small bookshelf of paperbacks she never finished reading. After she passed, I moved into that room myself. I did not move back into our old bedroom upstairs. I could not bring myself to sleep in that bed without her in it, and so I stayed in the small room at the back of the house, with her reading chair still in the corner, her handwriting still visible in pencil on the closet shelf liner where she'd once labeled which shelf held which of the girl's old baby clothes, kept in case grandchildren ever came along and needed hand-me-downs. I slept in that room for 4 years. It was not the master bedroom. It was not the largest or the finest room in the house. But it was mine, in the particular way a room becomes yours after you've grieved inside it for 4 winters, and I want you to hold on to that detail, because it is the room Paige eventually asked me to give up. The confrontation itself happened on a Thursday evening in November, 3 weeks before Paige's due date. She and Trevor came by without calling first, which had become something of a pattern over the preceding months, and I remember I was standing at the stove making myself a plate of eggs and toast for dinner, a simple bachelor's meal, nothing fancy, and I heard the front door open before I heard the knock, because Paige still had a key from years back and had simply stopped using the doorbell. They came into the kitchen, Paige moving with the careful, deliberate walk of a woman 7 months along, Trevor a half-step behind her the way he always positioned himself. And Paige did not sit down at the table. She stood in the kitchen doorway with her arms crossed over her belly, and she said, without any preamble at all, "Dad, we need to talk about the house." I set my spatula down. "All right," I said. "Talk." "We've been thinking," she said, and I noticed the way I always noticed it, though Trevor said nothing at all during the entire conversation, standing behind her with his hands in his jacket pockets like a man watching a play he had already seen rehearsed. "We've been thinking that with the baby coming, and with this house being so much more space than you need, it makes sense for us to move in. Just until we find something of our own. 6 months, maybe a year. And obviously the baby needs a nursery." I looked at her for a long moment. "Which room were you thinking?" I asked, though I already knew, the way you already know the ending of a story the moment the narrator's voice changes. "The back room," she said. "Your room. It gets the best light in the morning, and it's away from the stairs, which matters with a newborn. You could take the room upstairs. Mom's old sewing, I mean your old room. You barely use the upstairs anyway." I want you to sit with that phrase for a second the way I had to sit with it that evening, standing at my own stove with a spatula in my hand. Your old room. She meant the master bedroom. The room where Doris and I had slept for 25 years before her illness moved her downstairs. The room I had not been able to bring myself to sleep in for 4 years, not because of the stairs, not because of the light, but because Doris's absence lived inside that room in a way it did not live inside the small back bedroom, where at least her reading chair still sat in the corner like an old friend keeping me company. "I'm not ready to give up that room," I said. My voice came out steady, which surprised me a little, given how unsteady I felt inside. "Dad," Paige said, and there was an edge creeping into her voice now, the particular edge she'd had since she was a teenager, the one that meant she had decided the conversation should already be over and anyone still talking was simply being difficult. "It's a room. It's not like Mom's still in it. She's gone. You need to stop treating this house like a shrine." I set the spatula down entirely and turned to face her fully. Trevor shifted his weight behind her but said nothing. "I am not treating this house like a shrine," I said. "I am living in it. There's a difference." "Then live in a different room," Paige said. "I'm not asking you to leave the house, Dad. I'm asking you to give your niece or nephew a nursery in the house their grandfather owns. That's not an unreasonable thing to ask. I want to be honest with you about what I felt in that moment, because I think it matters more than the anger did. What I felt first was not anger. It was a kind of vertigo, the specific dizziness of realizing that a conversation you thought was about logistics has actually, this whole time, been about something else entirely, about whether your presence in your own life still requires anyone's permission at all. "I need some time to think about this," I said. Paige's jaw tightened. "Dad, the baby's due in 3 weeks. We don't have time for you to think about it. Trevor's lease is up at the end of the month anyway, so this actually works out. We were going to start moving some things in this weekend. This weekend, I repeated. Paige's chin lifted, the way it always did when she decided a fight was worth having. Dad, she said, and her voice went flat and hard in a way I had heard perhaps 3 times in her entire life, twice as a teenager and once at her mother's funeral, when grief made her sharp instead of soft. Here's the thing. You're 71. You live alone in a 4-bedroom house you can barely keep clean. I have a baby coming in 3 weeks and nowhere permanent to raise it. So here's what's going to happen. Either you give us the back room for the nursery and move upstairs like a reasonable person, or you find somewhere else to live, because frankly, Dad, an empty house with an old man rattling around in it makes less sense than a full house with a family in it who actually needs the space. The kitchen went very quiet. I could hear the refrigerator humming. I could hear, somewhere outside, a neighbor's dog barking twice and then falling silent. I looked at my daughter's face, 7 months pregnant, jaw set, arms crossed over the child she was carrying, and I thought about the 15 years of daycare and orthodontist bills and driving lessons and a wedding I had paid for in full, every penny of it, 6 years earlier, without complaint, without keeping a ledger of what she owed me for any of it, because that is not how a father is supposed to love his children. And I thought, too, about Renee, 42 now, who had never once in her life asked me for anything beyond my company, and who I sometimes worried had been shortchanged her whole life simply for being the daughter who didn't make demands. I hear you, Paige, I said. I appreciate the clarity. Something in my tone must have registered as wrong to her, because her eyes narrowed slightly, the way they used to when she was young and sensed she'd pushed a joke one step too far and the adult in front of her had gone quiet in a way that wasn't the same as agreement. But she said nothing further. She and Trevor left a few minutes later, Paige telling me over her shoulder that she'd call Saturday to coordinate moving the first boxes in, and the front door closed behind them, and I stood alone in my kitchen with a plate of cold eggs and a silence in the house so complete I could hear my own pulse in my ears. I did not eat the eggs. I sat down at the kitchen table, the same table Doris had once kept her ledgers on, though it had long since been replaced by a newer one, and I put both hands flat on the surface, and I thought, for a long time, about what I actually owned, and what that ownership actually meant, and whether I had been living, without quite realizing it, as a guest inside my own life for longer than I wanted to admit. Here is something I need to tell you now, something Paige did not know, something Trevor did not know, something even Renee did not fully know the details of, though she knew the shape of it in outline. 2 years earlier, in the fall of 2021, not long after Paige's first gentle suggestion that I consider selling the house, I had gone to see an old friend of mine, a man named Selwyn Pruitt, who had been my attorney for nearly 30 years. Ever since he'd helped me incorporate Combs Heating and Air back in 1986 for a modest fee and a handshake that had turned into a genuine friendship over the following decades. I hadn't gone to Selwyn because I suspected anything sinister at the time. I want to be clear about that. I went to him because I am a careful man, the kind of man who reads a contract twice before signing it and checks a customer's invoice 3 times before sending it out, and something about the way Paige had started talking about the house, casually, repeatedly, with just a little too much specificity about square footage and resale value, had put a small, quiet alarm bell in the back of my mind. The same kind of alarm bell that used to go off on job sites when a compressor was running just slightly rough, not enough to fail yet, but enough that an experienced ear knew something needed attention before it became a real problem. Walter, Selwyn had said to me that afternoon in his office on Cumberland Street, sitting behind the same scarred oak desk he'd had since 1989, "What exactly are you worried about?" "I'm not worried about anything specific," I told him. "I just want to make sure that whatever happens to me, however things go as I get older, this house stays exactly where I want it to stay, in whoever's hands I want it to be in, and nobody can maneuver me out of my own front door through pressure or persuasion or plain exhaustion." Selwyn had nodded slowly, the way he always did when he was thinking through the legal architecture of a problem before he spoke. "There's a way to do that cleanly," he said. We put the house into a revocable trust, with you as the sole trustee during your lifetime. You keep full control, you can sell it, renovate it, live in it, do anything you want with it, exactly as you do now. Nothing changes day to day. But the deed itself transfers out of your individual name and into the trust's name. And the trust document specifies exactly what happens to the property, and under exactly what circumstances, both while you're alive and after you're gone. I asked him what kinds of circumstances a document like that could account for. Selwyn had smiled slightly, the particular smile of a man who has spent 3 decades watching families come apart over property, and knows exactly which clauses matter most in the moments that actually count. We can specify occupancy rights, he said. We can specify that no family member, regardless of relation, has any legal claim to occupy, alter, or force the sale of the property without your explicit written consent, notarized and filed. We can specify a right of continued sole residency for you, for as long as you're living and capable, that cannot be overridden by majority vote of beneficiaries, family pressure, or anything short of a court finding you legally incompetent, which, Walter, frankly, looking at you, is not something I expect to be signing paperwork for any time soon. We had drawn up the trust document over the following 6 weeks, in the fall and early winter of 2021. I did not tell Paige. I did not tell Trevor. I told Renee, because Renee was the one I trusted to hold information without turning it into leverage, and because I wanted at least one of my daughters to understand, if anything ever happened to me, exactly what the paperwork said and exactly why it existed. Renee had asked me only one question when I told her. Dad, she said, is this because of something Paige said? And I had told her the truth, which was that it wasn't about any one thing Paige had said, but about a pattern I had started to notice, the way you notice a pattern in a compressor's rough idle before you can name exactly which part is failing. The document Selwyn drew up specified, in language far more precise than I can quote from memory, that the property at 14 Larkspur Lane was held in the Walter and Doris Combs Family Trust, that I retained sole and exclusive occupancy rights for my lifetime, that no beneficiary or family member held any right to compel a change in room assignment, occupancy, sale, or use of the property without my notarized written consent, and that any attempt to coerce, pressure, or force such a change through threat of abandonment, or otherwise would constitute grounds, at my sole discretion as trustee, for that individual's removal as a named beneficiary of the trust entirely. I had signed that document in December of 2021. Nearly 2 years before Paige ever stood in my kitchen doorway and told me to give up my room or find somewhere else to live. I had filed the original with the county recorder's office the following week. And I had gone on living my ordinary life for 2 years, cooking my eggs, mowing my lawn, visiting Doris's grave every other Sunday with fresh marigolds from the garden, never once mentioning the trust to Paige, because I had hoped, genuinely and sincerely, that I would never need to. I want to tell you about one more conversation from that period, before I move forward, because I think it rounds out the picture of exactly how deliberately, and how quietly, I had been preparing for a moment I hoped would never actually arrive. Every Tuesday morning for the better part of 20 years, I have had coffee at the Fenwick Street diner with 2 old friends from the trade, a retired electrician named Dwayne Pruitt, no relation to Selwyn despite the similar name, and a man named Otis Grable, who ran the sheet metal shop that supplied half the ductwork for my company across 3 decades of business between us. We are not men given to deep emotional conversation ordinarily. Our Tuesday mornings are typically spent discussing high school football scores, the price of copper, and whichever of us had the worst back pain that particular week. But in December of 2021, not long after Selwyn and I finalized the trust documents, I found myself, almost without planning to, telling Dwayne and Otis the broad shape of what I'd done, sitting in our usual booth with 3 cups of coffee going lukewarm between us. Dwayne had been quiet for a long moment, stirring sugar into his coffee that he never actually needed, a habit of his I'd noticed for years without ever mentioning. Walter, he finally said, you think you're being paranoid, doing all that. I can see it on your face. You think maybe you're borrowing trouble that isn't coming. I told him, honestly, that I hoped I was being paranoid. I hoped the whole document would sit in a drawer for the rest of my life, never once needed, a piece of careful over-engineering exactly like the redundant safety switches I used to install on commercial systems that never once tripped in 20 years of service, but which I installed anyway, because the cost of being wrong about needing them was too high to risk. Otis, who had buried his own wife 6 years earlier and raised 3 sons largely on his own afterward, had set down his coffee cup and looked at me with an expression I don't see from him often, given how rarely either of us strays into anything resembling sentiment. "Walter," he said, "I watched my boys go through some hard years after their mother passed. Grief does strange things to grown children, makes some of them softer and some of them harder, and sometimes it makes the same kid both those things depending on the week. I don't know which way your girls are going to go with this getting older business. But I'll tell you this much, a man who protects himself quietly, without ever needing to raise his voice about it, that's not paranoia. That's just wisdom that most men don't bother having until it's already too late to use it." I have thought about Otis's words many times in the years since, particularly in the months following that November evening in my kitchen. I do not believe grief alone explains what happened with Paige. I think the deeper roots run back through decades of small parenting choices, as I've already told you. But I do believe Otis was right about one thing in particular. The quiet wisdom of protecting yourself before you need protecting, of installing the safety switch long before the storm that might trip it, is not paranoia, and it is not distrust of the people you love. It is simply respect for the fact that people, even people you love with your whole heart, are capable of surprising you, in both directions, and a prudent man prepares for that possibility without ever wishing for it to come true. I need to pause here, because what I'm about to tell you next changes the shape of everything, and I don't want you to miss it. If you're still with me, drop the number 14 in the comments. That's the house number on Larkspur Lane, so I know you're still sitting with me through this. Fair warning, the story from here carries a few fictional elements woven in to bring the truth of it to life more clearly. If that's not the kind of telling you're looking for, this is a fine place to step away, and I mean that with real respect. For those staying, let's keep going. The Saturday after the confrontation in my kitchen, Paige called at 9 in the morning, cheerful, brisk, entirely unaware that anything about our Thursday conversation had shifted anything at all in my thinking. "Hey Dad," she said, "we're coming by around 11 to start moving some of the nursery stuff in. Trevor's got the truck." I told her that would be fine, and I want you to notice that I did not argue with her on the phone. I did not tell her not to come. I had already decided, sitting alone at my kitchen table 2 nights earlier, exactly how I intended to handle this, and shouting into a telephone was no part of that plan. I spent Friday, the day between the confrontation and the moving truck, doing 3 things. First, I called Selwyn Pruitt and asked him to meet me at his office first thing Saturday morning, before Paige and Trevor arrived at the house. Second, I went through the back bedroom, Doris's old sewing room, my room for the past 4 years, and I packed a single suitcase, 3 changes of clothes, my shaving kit, the framed photograph of Doris from our wedding day that had sat on the nightstand for 4 years, and the small leather Bible she'd given me the Christmas before she passed, inscribed on the inside cover in her own careful handwriting. Third, I called Renee. "Dad," she said, when I told her what had happened in the kitchen 2 nights before, her voice going tight and controlled in the specific way it did when she was furious but working hard not to let the fury spill over into something unhelpful. "She said that to you? In your own house?" "She did," I said. "Word for word, as close as I can remember it." Renee was quiet for a moment on the line. Then she said, "What do you need from me?" "I need you to know what I'm about to do," I told her, "so that when it happens, you're not blindsided by it, and so that if Paige comes to you afterward looking for someone to take her side, you'll already understand the full shape of things before she gets a chance to tell you her version first." "Tell me," Renee said. And so I told my older daughter, sitting in her kitchen 40 minutes away with her own 2 boys presumably watching cartoons somewhere in the background, about the trust Selwyn and I had drawn up 2 years earlier, about the occupancy clause, about the removal of beneficiary provision, and about exactly what I intended to do on Saturday morning before the moving truck arrived. Renee was quiet for a long moment after I finished. Then she said, very simply, "Dad, you should have told me sooner just so I could have been prepared for this day coming. But I understand why you didn't. And I want you to know, whatever happens tomorrow, I'm not going to be angry at you for it. You've given that girl every chance in the world to treat you with basic respect, and she's had 2 years to notice the pattern shifting and choose differently, and she didn't. I want to tell you honestly that hearing my older daughter say those words did something to the tight place behind my ribs that had been aching since Thursday evening. It didn't undo the hurt. But it reminded me that I was not standing entirely alone in this, and that mattered more than I can easily put into words. Saturday morning, I drove to Selwyn's office at 8, an hour before the office technically opened, because Selwyn, God bless him, had told me the night before that he'd meet me whenever I needed. Trust matters don't keep business hours when a client's dignity is on the line, Walter. We sat across from each other at his same scarred oak desk, and I told him what I wanted to do. I want to exercise the removal clause, I told him. Not out of spite. Out of necessity. My daughter gave me an ultimatum in my own home, told me to give up my room or leave, and I think the trust document exists precisely for a moment like this one. Selwyn nodded slowly, the way he always did when he was working through the legal weight of something before speaking. Walter, he said, I want to make sure you understand exactly what this means before we do it. Right now, both your daughters are named as equal beneficiaries of the trust, meaning upon your passing, the property and its associated value would be divided equally between them, or dispersed according to whatever secondary instructions you've specified. If we execute the removal clause against Paige today, on the grounds of coercive pressure regarding occupancy, she is removed entirely as a beneficiary. Not reduced. Removed. The full value of the trust, upon your passing, would then pass to Renee alone, or to whatever alternate beneficiary structure you specify in her place. This is not a small adjustment, Walter. This is a permanent, documented, legally final decision, and I want you to sit with that weight for a moment before we sign anything. I sat with it. I want you to understand that I genuinely sat with it, right there in Selwyn's office, for what felt like a long 2 or 3 minutes of silence while he waited, patient as ever, letting me arrive at my own conclusion rather than pushing me toward his. She gave me 2 choices, Paige did, I finally said. Give up my room, or leave my own house. She never once considered that there might be a third option, that the house was never entirely hers to make demands about in the first place, and that a father who has given everything to his children for 40 years is still, in the end, a man entitled to sleep in peace in his own home without being maneuvered out of it by his own blood. I'm not doing this because I want to punish her, Selwyn. I'm doing it because she needs to understand, in the clearest and most permanent way I know how to make her understand, that respect isn't something she's entitled to withhold from me and still expect an inheritance from me in return. Those 2 things were never supposed to be separate ledgers. She's been keeping them separate her whole life, and it's time the ledgers came together. Selwyn drew up the documentation that morning, the formal removal of Paige Combs Hartley as a named beneficiary of the Walter and Doris Combs Family Trust, on the documented grounds of coercive pressure regarding my occupancy rights as sole trustee, with Renee named as sole remaining beneficiary of the full trust corpus, the house at 14, Larkspur Lane specifically included. I signed the document at 9:40 that Saturday morning. Selwyn's paralegal notarized it. He filed the amendment with the county recorder that same afternoon, ensuring it was a matter of public record before the weekend was even finished. I drove home from Selwyn's office at 10. The moving truck, Trevor's rented U-Haul, was already parked in my driveway when I pulled in, and Paige was standing on the front porch directing 2 of Trevor's friends as they carried an empty crib, disassembled into its component pieces, up the front walk. Dad, she called out cheerfully when she saw my car, come on, we need you to help clear out the back room. Where've you been? I got out of my car slowly, the suitcase I had packed the day before still sitting in my trunk, and I walked up to my own front porch, and I looked at my daughter, 7 months pregnant, cheerful and entirely unaware that anything in her world had shifted since Thursday evening, and I said, Paige, I need you and Trevor to come inside for a moment. We need to talk before anyone moves anything else. Something in my tone must have registered, because her cheerfulness faded slightly at the edges, replaced by the particular wariness she'd worn as a teenager whenever she suspected she was about to be told something she didn't want to hear. We went into the kitchen. Trevor followed a step behind, as always. I sat down at the table. I did not offer anyone coffee. I set the folder Selwyn had given me, the notarized amendment, the cover letter explaining its provisions in plain language, on the table between us, and I slid it across to Paige. "What is this?" she asked, though something in her voice had already gone tight, the way a voice tightens when a person senses, before they've read a single word, that whatever is in front of them is not going to be good news. "Read it," I said. She read it. I watched her face as she read it, watched the particular slow drain of color that happens when a person understands, in real time, that a decision they assumed was permanently theirs to make has, in fact, already been made by someone else, and made in a direction they never once considered possible. Paige looked up from the papers, her hand trembling slightly against the table's edge. "Dad," she said, her voice cracking on the single syllable in a way I had not heard since she was a teenager, "you're removing me from the trust? Over a room? Over a conversation?" "Not over a room," I said, and I kept my voice level, though it cost me more than I let show. "Over an ultimatum. You stood in my kitchen 3 days ago, in the home I have lived in and paid for and maintained for 30 years, and you told me to give up the one room in this house that still has your mother's handwriting on the closet shelf, or find somewhere else to live entirely. You did not ask me. You did not discuss it with me as an equal. You told me, as though my consent in my own home was something you had already decided you didn't need. And you did that, Paige, after 2 years of slowly, steadily making it clear to me, in 100 small ways, that my presence in this family's day-to-day life mattered less than your convenience did." "Dad, that's not fair," Paige said, and I could see, even through her shock, the old argumentative reflex kicking in, the same one she'd had since she was 13. "I'm having a baby. I needed space. I wasn't trying to hurt you." "Maybe you weren't trying to," I said. "But you did, and more importantly, you told me plainly that if I didn't comply with what you wanted, I could find somewhere else to live. You gave me 2 choices, Paige. Give in or get out. I want you to understand something, and I want you to hear it clearly, because I'm only going to say it once. I found a third option. I'm not giving in, and I'm not getting out. I'm staying exactly where I am, in exactly the room I choose, for exactly as long as I choose to stay there. And you are no longer a beneficiary of anything I own, because I will not spend the rest of my life wondering whether my daughter loves me or is simply waiting on an inheritance she believes is owed to her regardless of how she treats me along the way." Trevor, silent until this point, finally spoke. "Mr. Combs," he said, with the careful, placating tone he always used when he sensed the situation sliding somewhere he didn't have the standing to control, "I don't think Paige meant it the way it—" I looked at him. "Trevor," I said not unkindly, but with a finality that stopped him mid-sentence, "you stood behind her the entire conversation on Thursday and said nothing at all, not one word, while your wife told her father to give up his room or leave his own home. I don't need you to explain her intentions to me now. I needed you to say something then, if you disagreed with what she was doing. You didn't. That tells me everything I need to know about where you stand." Paige was crying now, quietly, one hand pressed against her belly, the other still gripping the edge of the folder Selwyn had prepared. "Dad, please," she said, "this isn't— you can't just cut me out over one conversation. I'm your daughter." "You are my daughter," I said, and my own voice caught, just slightly, on that word, because nothing about this was easy for me, nothing about it felt like victory, whatever it might look like from the outside. "You will always be my daughter. That does not change, and it is not what's being decided here today. What's being decided is whether you inherit a house and an estate from a father you were willing to displace from his own bedroom the moment it became inconvenient to you. Those are 2 entirely separate questions, Paige, and I think you've spent your whole life assuming they were the same question, and I let you assume that, because I never once drew the line clearly enough for you to see it. I'm drawing it today." She left, eventually, that Saturday afternoon, Trevor's friends quietly reassembling the crib pieces back into the truck bed while Paige sat in the passenger seat of Trevor's car, her face turned toward the window, not looking at the house as they pulled away. I stood on my own front porch and watched them go, and I did not feel triumphant. I want to be honest with you about that. I felt like a man who had just performed a necessary surgery on his own family, and was now standing in the recovery room, uncertain whether the patient would live or simply survive in some diminished form. I need to stop here for a moment, because what comes next in this story is the part one almost didn't tell you. Type 9 in the comments if you want to hear the rest. I'll know you're still here with me. And one more note before we go on. The chapters ahead carry some fictionalized elements woven in for the sake of the telling. If that's not what you came here for, this is a fine place to step away, with my full respect. For those staying, let's keep going together. Before I tell you what happened in the months that followed, I need to back up and tell you about a phone call I received 4 days after I signed that removal document, because it changed the shape of everything that came after it, and because I think it will surprise you the way it surprised me. The call came on a Wednesday evening from a woman named Carol Hartley, Trevor's mother, whom I had met perhaps a dozen times over the 6 years since Paige and Trevor's wedding, always at holiday gatherings, always pleasant in the careful, surface way that in-laws are pleasant with each other when either party has any particular investment in the relationship beyond keeping the peace for the sake of the children they share between them. "Walter," she said when I picked up, her voice carrying a briskness I hadn't heard from her before, "I understand there's been some trouble between you and Paige." I told her carefully that there had been a disagreement, yes, and that I didn't feel it was my place to discuss the details with her, given that it was a matter between myself and my daughter. Carol was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Walter, I'll be honest with you, because I think honesty is the only thing that matters at a moment like this. Trevor called me Sunday night upset, saying you'd cut Paige out of your will over an argument about a bedroom. And I want you to know, before you say anything else, that I think you did the right thing." I confess that surprised me. I had expected, if anyone from Trevor's side of the family called at all, that the call would be an appeal on Paige's behalf, a plea for reconsideration, perhaps even a veiled accusation that I was being cruel to a pregnant woman. I had not expected support, and certainly not from a woman I barely knew. "I raised 3 sons," Carol continued, "and if any one of them had ever stood in my kitchen and told me to give up my bedroom or get out of my own house, I would have done a great deal more than remove them from a trust, Walter. I would have removed them from my Christmas card list entirely." She said this with a dry, humorless edge that made it clear she meant every word. "I called because I wanted you to know that not everyone in this extended family thinks what Paige did was acceptable." Trevor stood behind her the whole time and said nothing, and frankly, that troubles me more than anything Paige said herself, because he's my son, and I raised him better than to stand silent while an elderly man is bullied out of his own bedroom. I thanked her for the call, genuinely moved by it, though I want to be honest and tell you that it also complicated something for me. It is one thing to feel confident in a difficult decision when you believe you are the only one who sees the situation clearly. It is another thing entirely to discover that other people, further removed from the daily texture of your family than you are, have also seen the pattern plainly, and have simply been too polite, until now, to say so out loud. Carol's call was not the last one of its kind. 2 weeks later, Trevor's older brother, a quiet man named Dean whom I had met only twice, sent me a brief, awkward text message that read, simply, "Mr. Combs, I heard what happened. For what it's worth, I think you did right by yourself. Hope things settle for everyone eventually." I did not know quite what to make of these small, unexpected gestures of support from a family I had always considered peripheral to my own, but I found, in the weeks that followed, that they mattered more to my steadiness than I would have predicted. I need to tell you now about Trevor's job, because what happened to him in January was not something I orchestrated, was not something I wished for, and was not, in any way, connected to my decision about the trust, but it mattered enormously to how the rest of this story unfolded, and I think you deserve the full picture rather than a convenient simplification of it. Trevor had worked for 6 years at a regional logistics company, Holloway Freight Solutions, managing route scheduling for a fleet of delivery trucks across 4 counties. It was steady, unglamorous work, the kind of middle management position that pays reasonably well without ever making a man rich, and Trevor had, by all accounts I ever heard, performed the job competently, if without any particular distinction, for the entire 6 years he held it. In January, Holloway Freight Solutions was acquired by a larger logistics conglomerate out of the Midwest, and as so often happens in these acquisitions, the new ownership conducted what they euphemistically called a redundancy review across the merged company's middle management layer. Trevor's entire department, 14 people, was eliminated in a single Thursday afternoon meeting, replaced by a smaller centralized scheduling team operating out of the conglomerate's headquarters 3 states away. Trevor received 2 weeks of severance pay and a form letter thanking him for his years of service. I learned about this from Renee, who had heard it from Paige, who had called her sister in a state of genuine panic the same week it happened. "Dad," Renee told me on our Sunday call, "they don't have savings. Trevor's severance runs out in 2 weeks, and Paige is still on unpaid maternity leave, and their rent is due on the 1st, and I think, Dad, I think they're actually scared." I want to be honest with you about what I felt hearing this. I did not feel vindicated. I did not sit in my kitchen with any sense of satisfaction that circumstances were now delivering, on their own, a consequence I myself had already delivered through the trust. What I felt was something far more complicated, a father's helpless worry for a daughter's well-being, sitting directly alongside a hard-won conviction that I was not the one obligated to solve this particular problem for her, because solving problems without ever requiring accountability was precisely the pattern that had led us to a kitchen doorway ultimatum in the first place. I did not call Paige that week. I want you to understand that this was not coldness on my part. It was restraint, the specific, disciplined restraint of a man who has learned, late in life, that rescuing a person from every consequence of their choices is not the same thing as loving them, and can, in fact, be its own quiet form of disrespect, because it tells the person you don't believe they're capable of finding their own way through difficulty. Renee, for her part, occupied a different position entirely in all of this. And I think her role in the months between the confrontation and the eventual reconciliation deserves its own telling, because without my older daughter, I am not entirely certain the eventual outcome would have gone the way it did. Renee had never once, in all her 42 years, asked me for anything beyond my time and my company. She and Curtis had built a comfortable, modest life together. He worked as a civil engineer for the county. She taught 4th grade at Danbury Elementary, the same school system Combs Heating and Air had serviced for 18 years. And in all the years since she'd left my house at 18 for college, she had never once come to me with her hand out, never once treated our relationship as a ledger to be balanced in her favor. I confess that for a long time, I worried this meant Renee simply loved me less demonstratively than her sister did, that her quiet, undemanding presence in my life was somehow a lesser form of devotion than Paige's louder, more frequent, more overtly needy version of the relationship. I want to tell you plainly now that I was wrong about that, and that the months following the trust decision taught me exactly how wrong I had been. It was Renee who drove out to my house every single Sunday without fail throughout that entire winter, rain or shine, bringing her boys, letting them run through the yard the way she once had, sitting with me at my kitchen table for an hour or 2 of unhurried conversation that asked nothing of me beyond my presence. It was Renee who, without ever being asked, began quietly checking in on me during the week as well, a brief text on Wednesday evenings, just to see how I was doing, small and unremarkable and utterly consistent. And it was Renee, in early February, who sat me down at my own kitchen table, the same table, always the same table, the true center of gravity in this entire story, and said something I have carried with me ever since. "Dad," she said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to actually hear it rather than brushing it off the way you sometimes do. I have never once felt like the favorite daughter in this family. I want to be honest about that. Paige got more latitude growing up, more forgiveness, more of Mom and Dad's attention when things got hard for her, and I made peace with that a long time ago because I understood, even as a kid, that Paige simply needed more management than I did. But Dad, I need you to know that watching you finally draw a line, watching you finally say out loud that respect matters as much as blood does, that was not something that made me feel vindicated over my sister. It made me feel, for the first time in my whole life, like our family actually had a floor underneath it. Like there were rules that applied to everyone, instead of rules that bent depending on how loudly someone was willing to demand something. I did not have a ready response to that. I sat with it for a long moment, the way I have learned slowly, over the years, that some things a person says deserve silence before they deserve an answer. "Thank you for telling me that," I finally said. "I think I needed to hear it more than you probably realize. I want to return now to Trevor and Paige's situation that winter, because the financial collapse that followed his job loss did not resolve itself quickly or cleanly, and I think the details matter to understanding exactly how the eventual reconciliation came about, and why it came about honestly rather than out of simple desperation. By early February, Trevor had applied to over 30 positions across 3 counties without a single interview offer, a fact that Renee relayed to me with the careful neutrality of a woman trying not to editorialize about her brother-in-law's job prospects. Paige had returned to work earlier than she'd planned, cutting her maternity leave short by 6 weeks, placing baby Wesley in daycare at a facility that, according to Renee, cost nearly as much per month as their rent did, simply because they could no longer absorb the loss of her income on top of Trevor's. They fell behind on rent in March, a single month, caught up by borrowing from Trevor's brother Dean, the same Dean who had texted me his quiet support 2 months earlier. They fell behind again in April, and this time there was no borrowing left to be done, because Dean, sympathetic as he was, had his own young family and his own mortgage and could not keep extending a lifeline that had no clear end point in sight. I learned, though not until much later, from Paige herself, during one of our slowly rebuilding conversations that spring, that she had, in fact, considered calling me during those months, more than once, sitting with the phone in her hand, staring at my name in her contacts, and had ultimately talked herself out of it every single time. "I couldn't do it, Dad," she told me, months later, once enough trust had been rebuilt between us that she could say this honestly without fear of the conversation collapsing entirely. I sat there with the phone in my hand in March, genuinely not sure how we were going to make rent, and I thought about calling you, and then I thought about what I'd actually be asking for. I'd be asking the man I told to give up his bedroom or get out of his own house to bail me out financially 6 weeks later. I couldn't make myself do it. Not because I thought you'd say no. I think some part of me was terrified you'd say yes, that you'd just quietly wire the money the way you always used to quietly fix things for me growing up, and I'd never actually have to sit with what I'd done. I needed to sit with it, Dad. I think some part of me knew that even then, even though it terrified me. I want to be honest with you about how genuinely moved I was to hear my daughter say this, because it told me something I had not fully understood until that moment, that the removal clause, the trust decision, the entire painful ordeal of that November evening, had done something I had hoped for but had not been at all certain it would actually accomplish. It had created space for Paige to encounter the natural consequences of her own choices without a safety net quietly catching her before she ever felt the fall. And in that space, however painful it had been for her to sit inside, something in her had genuinely begun to shift. They did not lose the rental that spring, in the end, though it came close. Trevor found a position in April, a step down from his previous role in both pay and title, managing inventory logistics for a regional grocery distributor, work that Renee told me he took without complaint, without any of the wounded pride I might have expected from a man used to a somewhat higher station. Paige told me later that watching Trevor take that job, quietly, without bitterness, without treating it as beneath him, had been its own small turning point for her, a reminder that dignity has very little to do with title or salary and everything to do with how a person carries themselves through a difficult season. I want to tell you about one more conversation before I bring you back to the reconciliation itself. Because I think it matters, and because it happened in a place I did not expect it to happen. In late February, roughly 3 months after the confrontation, I ran into Paige by accident at the Fenwick Street Diner. The same diner where I had my regular Tuesday coffee with my 2 old friends from the trade. She was there alone, on what I later learned was her lunch break, sitting in a booth near the window with baby Wesley's car seat set carefully on the bench beside her, though the baby himself was, at that particular hour, at daycare, and I never did learn why she'd brought the empty car seat along with her that day, whether out of habit or exhaustion or some quieter reason she never explained. She saw me before I saw her. "Dad," she said, and her voice carried a startled, uncertain quality, as though she hadn't fully decided, in the split second of recognition, whether to greet me warmly or brace herself for something harder. I sat down across from her, uninvited, the way a father sometimes simply decides to sit down across from his daughter regardless of whether an invitation has been formally extended. We did not discuss the trust that day. We did not discuss the confrontation directly at all. We talked, haltingly at first and then more easily, about Wesley's sleeping habits, about Trevor's new position, about an old family friend of ours who had recently passed, and by the end of that unplanned 20-minute conversation, something had loosened slightly between us, some small piece of the 4 months of silence finally finding a place to set itself down. I paid for her coffee before I left. It was a small thing, $5, nothing at all in the scheme of everything else that had happened between us. But I want you to understand why I did it, because I think the reason matters. I did not pay for her coffee because I was quietly signaling that the trust decision might be reversible after all, that if she simply waited long enough, the old pattern of her father quietly smoothing over every difficulty would eventually reassert itself. I paid for her coffee because she was my daughter, sitting across from me in a diner booth, tired and uncertain, and a father can love his child completely, can pay for a $5 coffee out of pure unconditional affection, while still holding an entirely separate and unmovable line about respect and inheritance, and the difference between the two. I wanted her to see, in that small gesture, that both things could be true simultaneously, that I still loved her without condition, and that the trust decision still stood without exception, and that neither one of those facts diminished the other. The weeks that followed were quiet in a way I had not expected quiet to feel. Paige did not call. I did not call her. Renee called every Sunday as always, and told me, gently, that Paige had confided in her, tearfully, about what had happened, though Renee's version of events, relayed back to me secondhand, made it clear that Paige was still framing the whole affair as her father overreacting to a simple, practical family request, rather than as the culmination of 2 years of steadily eroding respect. She had the baby on the 15th of December, 3 days past her due date. A boy. Renee texted me a photograph the same evening, sent to her by Paige, of a small red-faced infant wrapped in a hospital blanket, and I sat alone in my kitchen looking at that photograph for a long while, feeling the particular ache of a grandfather who has not been invited to the hospital, who has not been told the child's name, who exists, for the moment, entirely outside the boundary of a story that continues without him. I did not push my way into that boundary. I want you to understand that. I did not call the hospital. I did not show up uninvited. I had made my decision about the trust with clear eyes, and I understood that a decision like that carries consequences that ripple outward in ways you cannot fully control once you've set them in motion. I sent a card, through Renee, a simple card congratulating them on the birth, with no mention of the trust, no mention of the ultimatum, simply a grandfather's genuine well wishes for a child who had done nothing wrong in any of this. I did not receive a reply. January passed. February passed. I kept living my ordinary life, my Tuesday morning coffee at the diner on Fenwick Street with 2 old friends from the trade, my Sunday visits to Doris's grave with fresh flowers, my Sunday evening calls with Renee and her boys. Combs Heating and Air, which I had sold the operational side of 6 years earlier while retaining a small ownership stake, continued along without much need for my involvement, and I found myself with a great deal of quiet time to sit with everything that had happened, to turn it over in my mind the way you turn over a piece of machinery, checking each part for wear, making sure you understand exactly how it failed before you try to fix it. It was Renee who told me, in early March, that things had started to shift for Paige and Trevor in ways that had nothing directly to do with me. Trevor had been let go from his position at the logistics company where he'd worked for 6 years, a casualty of a corporate restructuring that had nothing to do with his performance, and everything to do with a cost-cutting decision made 3 states away by executives who had never met him. Paige, on unpaid leave from her own job with a newborn at home, found herself, for the first time in her adult life, facing a financial reality that did not have her father's quiet, unspoken safety net sitting somewhere underneath it. I want to be honest with you about something here, because I think it matters. I did not feel satisfaction hearing this news. I felt something closer to a dull, complicated grief, the particular grief of a father who understands that the natural consequences of a person's choices are unfolding exactly as consequences do, without any intervention needed from him, and who still, despite everything, wishes circumstances were kinder to his child than they turned out to be. Renee told me, in mid-March, that Paige had asked her, carefully, cautiously, whether she thought I might be willing to talk. I told Renee to tell her that I was always willing to talk. I had never once, at any point in this entire ordeal, refused to speak with my daughter. What I had refused was to be told, in my own kitchen, that my presence in my own home was conditional on my compliance with her convenience. Paige called me on a Thursday evening in late March, almost exactly 4 months after the confrontation in my kitchen. Her voice, when I answered, sounded smaller than I remembered it, stripped of the brisk confidence it had carried the last time we'd spoken. "Dad," she said, "can I come by?" "Just to talk." "Not about the trust." "I mean, I don't know." "Just to talk." "Of course," I told her. "Come by whenever you're ready." She came the following Saturday morning, alone, without Trevor, without the baby, and she sat across from me at my kitchen table, the same table where I had slid Selwyn's folder across to her 4 months earlier, and for a long while she said nothing at all, simply turning a coffee mug slowly between her hands, staring down into it as though the right words might surface from the liquid itself if she waited long enough. "I'm sorry," she finally said. "Not because things went bad for Trevor and me. I'm not sorry because it's hard right now. I'm sorry because I've had 4 months to sit with what I actually said to you that night, and I keep hearing myself say it, and every time I hear it I feel sick, Dad. I told you to give up your room or leave your own house. I said that to you? My own father. In the home you built for us." I let her sit in that silence for a moment before I spoke, because I think some silences need to be sat in fully before anyone tries to fill them with reassurance. "I'm not going to pretend those 4 months didn't happen, Paige," I finally said. "And I'm not going to pretend the trust decision is something I'm going to reverse simply because you've come here and apologized. I want to be honest with you about that, because I think you deserve honesty more than you deserve comfort right now." "I understand," she said, and her eyes were wet, though she wasn't crying outright, simply holding the tears at the edge the way a person does when they're trying to stay composed enough to keep talking. "I'm not here asking you to undo it. I don't think I have the right to ask you that. I'm here because I don't want another 4 months, or 4 years, of my son growing up without knowing his grandfather, over something I did, not over something you did. I want to fix what I can fix, even if I can't fix all of it." I looked at my daughter, 39 years old, exhausted in the particular way new motherhood exhausts a person, humbled in a way I had genuinely never seen her humbled before, and I felt the tight place behind my ribs loosen, just slightly, for the first time in 4 months. "I'd like to meet my grandson," I said. "Whenever you're ready for that. And Paige, I want you to understand something clearly, because I don't want there to be any confusion about it going forward. Being back in each other's lives does not mean the trust reverses. Renee remains the sole beneficiary. That decision was made with clear eyes and it stands. What can change, starting today, if you want it to, is whether you and I have an honest relationship going forward, one built on respect rather than expectation. Those are 2 entirely separate things, and I need you to hold them separately in your mind from here on out, the way I should have taught you to hold them separately a long time ago." She nodded, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. "I understand, Dad," she said. "I do. And for what it's worth, I don't think I would have understood it 4 months ago. I think I needed to lose something to finally see what I'd been taking for granted the whole time." I met my grandson 3 weeks later, a small, solemn-eyed boy named Wesley, and I want to tell you that holding him in my kitchen, in the very room where his mother had once told me to give up my bedroom for his sake, felt like a strange and complicated kind of grace. Not a full resolution, not a clean happy ending tied up with a bow, but something more honest than that. Something closer to what real reconciliation actually looks like, which is two imperfect people choosing, slowly and deliberately, to keep showing up for each other despite everything that has already happened between them. But I want to tell you honestly that the reconciliation did not happen in one clean afternoon over one cup of coffee, however much a shorter version of this story might make it seem that way. It happened slowly, in fits and starts, across the better part of that year, and I think you deserve to hear the messier, more honest shape of it, because I suspect many of you listening tonight are somewhere in the middle of your own version of this exact process, and I don't want to give you a falsely tidy picture of how it goes. The first Sunday dinner Paige and Trevor attended back at the house, in late April, was not an easy one. I had invited them, along with Renee and Curtis and both sets of grandchildren, in what I intended as a gesture of goodwill, a chance for the family to sit together at one table the way we used to before any of this happened. Trevor arrived visibly uncomfortable, barely speaking through the first half of the meal, and I understood, watching him, that whatever he had said or not said in my kitchen doorway 5 months earlier was sitting on him just as heavily as anything Paige had said, perhaps more so, because at least Paige had since had the chance to apologize directly, while Trevor had never once addressed his own silence that night. It was Renee, of all people, who finally broke the tension at that dinner, leaning over toward Trevor partway through the meal and asking him plainly, in front of everyone, how the new job was going, whether he missed the old routing software or found the new systems easier to work with, small practical questions asked with genuine interest rather than pity, and I watched something in Trevor's shoulders loosen slightly as he answered her. Grateful, I think, for a bridge back into ordinary conversation that didn't require him to first navigate an apology he didn't yet know how to give. He gave that apology eventually, though not until early May, and not at the house at all, but standing in my driveway one Saturday afternoon when he'd come to drop off Wesley for a few hours while Paige ran errands, something we had by then quietly re-established as a small, regular arrangement between us. "Mr. Combs," he said, as he was buckling Wesley back into his car seat to leave, "I've been meaning to say something to you since November, and I keep not saying it, and I think that's exactly the problem, so I'm just going to say it now before I lose my nerve again. I stood there that night and said nothing while Paige told you to give up your own bedroom. I told myself at the time that it wasn't my place to get in the middle of a father-daughter conversation. But that wasn't the real reason. The real reason is I was scared of Paige when she got like that, and it was easier to stay quiet than to risk her turning that same energy on me. That's not an excuse. I just wanted you to know I understand now what silence like that actually costs, and I'm sorry for my part in it." I told him I appreciated him saying so, and I meant it, though I also told him, gently, that understanding a mistake after the fact is worth something, but it is worth considerably more when it changes how a man behaves the next time he's standing quietly beside someone he loves while that person does something he privately disagrees with. Trevor nodded slowly at that, and I believe, watching the months that followed, that he genuinely took it to heart. He has not been silent since, in the several small family disagreements that have inevitably arisen in the time since, the ordinary friction of any family finding its new footing. He speaks up now. It is a small thing, and it is also, I think, the single most important thing that changed in him through all of this. June brought its own small test of how genuinely things had shifted. Paige called me on a Wednesday evening, her voice tight in a way that immediately put me on alert, and told me that her car, an aging sedan that had been giving her trouble for months, had finally died entirely in the parking lot of Wesley's daycare, the repair estimate coming back at just over $1,100, money they did not have readily available even with Trevor's new position steadying their finances somewhat. I want you to understand what I felt in that moment, because I think it's important. My first instinct, the old instinct, the one built over decades of quietly smoothing every hard edge out of my daughters' lives before they ever had to feel it, was to simply offer to pay for the repair outright, no questions asked, the way I would have done without a second thought 2 years earlier. I did not do that. I sat with the discomfort of not doing that for a long moment on the phone, and then I told Paige, as gently as I knew how, that I would not be paying for the repair, but that I would be glad to help her think through her options, whether a payment plan with the mechanic, whether a small personal loan through her credit union, whether simply carpooling with a neighbor for a few weeks while she saved the difference herself. There was a long silence on the line after I said this. Then, to my genuine surprise, Paige said quietly, "Okay, Dad. That's fair. I think some part of me was hoping you'd just fix it, if I'm honest. But you're right not to. I'll figure it out." She did figure it out, in the end, through a combination of a small loan and 3 weeks of carpooling with a coworker, and she told me later, that August, that those 3 weeks of genuine inconvenience had taught her something she suspected she needed to learn for a very long time. That difficulty survived and solved on her own terms left her feeling steadier and more capable than any rescue ever had. However uncomfortable the process of getting there. By late summer, the rhythm between us had settled into something I recognize now, looking back, as the actual shape of healthy family relationship, rather than the shape I had mistakenly believed was healthy for most of my adult life. Paige called when she wanted to talk, not when she needed something. She asked my opinion on things and genuinely seemed to want to hear it, rather than simply waiting for me to agree with a decision she'd already made. She brought Wesley by most Sundays, sometimes with Trevor, sometimes without, and she never once, not a single time in all the months since, brought up the trust, or asked whether I'd reconsidered it, or treated our rebuilding relationship as a slow campaign toward eventually reversing what Selwyn and I had signed that Saturday morning in his office. I asked her about this directly, once, in late September, nearly 10 months after the original confrontation, because I wanted to understand honestly whether she had simply made peace with the trust decision or whether she was quietly hoping, somewhere underneath the visible reconciliation, that enough good behavior would eventually earn its reversal. Paige had been quiet for a long moment before answering, turning her coffee mug slowly on my kitchen table the way she had that first Saturday morning she'd come back to talk. "Dad," she finally said, "I'm not going to pretend it doesn't sting sometimes, thinking about it. I'd be lying if I said it didn't. But no, I'm not showing up every Sunday because I'm running some kind of long campaign to get back on a piece of paper. I'm showing up because I want my son to know his grandfather, and because I want you to know your grandson, and because somewhere in the last 10 months I actually learned the difference between loving someone and managing someone, and I'd rather have the real thing with you, even without the inheritance attached to it, than spend the rest of my life performing for a piece of paper. I think I finally understand that those were always supposed to be two separate things, exactly like you told me that Saturday. I just needed to actually live inside the consequence to understand it instead of just hearing the words. I want to tell you that hearing my daughter say that, sitting at my own kitchen table nearly a year after everything had come apart between us, did something to me that I am still, even now, not entirely able to put into plain words. It was not relief, exactly, though there was relief in it. It was something closer to the specific, quiet satisfaction of watching a difficult repair finally hold, the kind of satisfaction I used to feel decades ago, standing in someone's attic in the middle of a July heat wave, listening to a compressor I'd just fixed settle into a steady, even hum after months of running rough, knowing that the fix would hold not because I'd forced it to, but because I'd finally found and corrected the actual underlying problem instead of simply patching over the symptom one more time. Paige and Trevor found a small rental of their own that summer, modest but sufficient, and Paige has visited every other Sunday since, the way Renee always did, and something in the rhythm of our relationship has settled into a shape I did not expect but have come, slowly, to be grateful for. I want to tell you a little more about Wesley, and about the particular kind of second chance he ended up quietly giving me, because I don't think this story is complete without it. He was a serious baby, watchful in the way Renee had been as a child, and by the time he was old enough to toddle around my kitchen on his own two unsteady legs, sometime in the late summer of the following year, he had developed a habit of following me from room to room whenever Paige brought him by, standing at my elbow while I did small chores around the house. handing me tools he didn't understand the purpose of with an expression of total, solemn concentration that reminded me, more than I ever expected it to, of myself at that age, watching my own father work. I taught him, that second summer, the same small trick I had once taught Paige and Renee both as children, showing him how to hold a screwdriver properly, how to turn a screw clockwise to tighten it, a tiny, meaningless lesson in the scheme of things, except that it wasn't meaningless at all, because it was the first time since the confrontation in my kitchen that I had felt the particular, uncomplicated joy of simply being a grandfather, without any of the tangled grief or vigilance or careful boundary holding that had defined so much of the preceding year. Paige watched us from the kitchen doorway one Sunday afternoon that August, Wesley solemnly turning an unscrewed cabinet hinge over in his small hands while I knelt beside him explaining what each part did, and when I looked up, I saw that she was crying, quietly, one hand pressed against the doorframe. "I'm not upset, Dad," she said before I could ask. "I'm just watching you with him, and I keep thinking about how close I came to losing this. Not the house, not the money. This. Just this, right here. Watching you teach him something small and patient like that. I almost traded this away over a bedroom, and I don't think I understood, back in November, that this was actually the thing at stake the whole time. I did not have a ready answer for that, the way I have found, again and again throughout this whole ordeal, that some of my daughter's most honest moments simply required silence from me rather than a response. The following spring, nearly 18 months after the original confrontation, Paige asked me something I had not expected, sitting across from me at my kitchen table on an ordinary Sunday evening while Wesley napped in the next room. "Dad," she said, "would you be willing to come to Wesley's second birthday party? Not just the family dinner after, the actual party, with Trevor's whole family there, and some of our friends. I want them to see you there. I want them to understand that you're not just someone we mention. I want them to see that you're actually part of this." I told her I would be glad to come, and I want to tell you honestly that standing in Paige and Trevor's small rented backyard that June, surrounded by people I mostly didn't know, watching my grandson smear blue frosting across his own face with the particular gleeful abandon of a 2-year-old who has not yet learned that cake is meant to be eaten with some measure of restraint, I felt something settle inside me that I had not fully realized was still unsettled until that exact moment. It was not simply that Paige and I had repaired our relationship. It was that she had chosen, publicly and without any prompting from me, to place me back at the center of her family's life rather than at its careful, managed edges. That distinction mattered to me more than I can easily explain. Carol Hartley was at that party too, Trevor's mother, the same woman who had called me unprompted in the days after the original confrontation, and she sought me out near the drinks table partway through the afternoon, a paper cup of lemonade in her hand. "Walter," she said, "I'm glad to see this turned out the way it did. I meant what I said to you back in November. I'm glad you didn't let it slide. And I'm even gladder to see that everyone found their way back to each other properly, instead of just papering over it the way families so often do." I told her I was grateful for her call that winter, more grateful than I think I'd ever properly expressed, and she waved the thanks away with the brisk, no-nonsense gesture I had come to recognize as entirely characteristic of her. "Any decent grandmother would have called," she said. "I just happened to be the one who actually did it." I want to close this part of the story by telling you about the last conversation Paige and I had before I decided to sit down and record all of this for you tonight, because I think it captures, better than anything else I could tell you, exactly where things stand between us now, nearly 2 years after that November evening in my kitchen. We were sitting on my back porch, the same porch that overlooks the garden Doris planted along the east fence all those years ago, the marigolds still coming back faithfully every spring the way she always promised they would, and Paige asked me, out of nowhere, whether I ever regretted the trust decision, whether some part of me wished I had simply given in that first night and avoided all the pain that followed. I thought about the question honestly before I answered her, the way I try to think honestly about most things these days. "No," I told her. "I don't regret it. I regret that it was ever necessary in the first place. I regret the years before it, the small accumulating disrespects that made a moment like that possible at all. but the decision itself, no. I think if I hadn't drawn that line when I did, we would still be exactly where we were that Thursday evening, except further along, with more taken for granted and less ever named honestly between us. Sometimes the kindest thing a father can do for his child is refuse to keep absorbing what should never have been asked of him in the first place, even when refusing costs both of you dearly for a while. Paige had nodded slowly at that, looking out at the garden rather than at me. I think I needed you to actually mean it, she said. Not just threaten it, and cave the next week. I think if you'd caved, I would have kept pushing forever, the way I always had. You finally not caving, that's the only reason any of this actually changed. If there is a lesson in this story, and I believe there is one, it is this. Love and inheritance are not the same ledger, and a parent who conflates the two, out of guilt or fear or simple exhaustion, teaches their children that respect is optional as long as the money is still coming eventually. I loved my daughter through every year of her life, without exception, and I will continue loving her for whatever years I have left. But love does not require me to disappear from my own bedroom on command, and it never should have required that of me, and it should never require that of you, whoever you are, listening to this tonight in whatever kitchen or living room or quiet car you happen to be sitting in right now. I believe a father's dignity is not something he owes an apology for protecting. I believe the deed to your own life should always, in the end, have your own name on it, regardless of who else believes they're entitled to a room inside it. If any part of this story stayed with you tonight, tell me in the comments. I read every one. If someone you know is being quietly pushed out of their own life by people who claim to love them, share this with them. It costs you nothing, and it might mean everything to somebody who needs to hear it today. Subscribe if you'd like to stay close. There is more of this family's story worth telling. Thank you, truly, for staying with me all the way to the end. One final note before you go. The chapters in this telling carry fictionalized elements woven in to bring a human truth to life more clearly. If that isn't the kind of content you're looking for, no hard feelings at all, choose what serves you, and take good care of yourself.